Amanda Jokerst. I'm 24 years old and I graduated in 2007 from Wheaton College with a degree in theology and sociology. I currently work for Christian Peacemaker Teams, also known as CPT, and we are an organization that sends out teams to international sites around the world, particularly places of violent conflict, to physically get in the way of violence and also to work with local peace and justice workers, human rights activists, community organizers in the local communities. So we currently have teams in Colombia, in Israel-Palestine, in Iraq, in Canada, and then some exploratory projects in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and also in the Philippines. I first heard about Christian Peacemaker Teams, I think it was my junior year of college, and there was a news report about some Christian peace activists in Iraq that was taken hostage. There was 4, and they were held for 118 days, and at the end of that time period, one member, Tom Fox, he was killed, and I was just following the story, and I was just so astounded that there were Christians that were doing what Jesus called us to do, to lay down our lives for one another, and they were literally putting themselves in places where that was a reality on a day-to-day basis, that they could be killed because they were standing for the path that Jesus called us to walk on, to love our enemies and to love one another sacrificially. And even as Paul says, you know, make your bodies living sacrifices, and I believe that's what Tom Fox did. He literally became a sacrifice for the way of Jesus. These men that were captured were over there because they saw what our government was doing and how unjust it was, how we were treating the Iraqi people and bombing them, destroying their cities, and, you know, bringing nothing good really out of this invasion that we were doing in the name of freedom and in the name of justice. So I decided that after college, this is an organization I really wanted to be a part of, to put my life on the line as well. And one of the things I think is so beautiful about CPT is, you know, so many overseas organizations that Christians are involved in are very missional in those areas, but our mission is more to the church here, especially in North America, to tell them that what the church has been aligning themselves with for the past, you know, few centuries isn't really what Jesus was talking about when he said to follow him. Back when Constantine, an emperor of the Roman Empire, he wed Christianity with the state, and that was the first time that Christianity became affiliated with war and with violence and with conquest. And before that, the early Christian church had no participation in war. They refused military service, and they were churches of peace. They were pacifists. They didn't comply with any violence, and especially not the violence of the state. So I think that's a really important mission of CPT, is to call churches back to their first love, to Jesus, to be followers of the way. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a man that I think both camps in, you know, being pro-war, anti-war, and, you know, one side will say, well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you know, he committed violence, he tried to assassinate Hitler. But I think what we often don't hear in that story is that right before he attempted the assassination, he asked for forgiveness in his letters. He talks about how in agony he was over this decision, and how, you know, in the end he knew it wasn't the right thing to do. He asked God for forgiveness and for mercy because he understood that he was sinning. He understood that that wasn't the way that, as a Christian, that he should be acting by doing violence to another human being. And when we talk about the Old and the New Testament, you know, people often say how they contradict each other, especially on this issue of violence. And Jesus, he was very saturated in the Hebrew Scriptures, and he was standing in that tradition, and he saw the trajectory that his people were on with this spiral of violence, been in it day in and day out. And in the, you know, the current history of the violence of the Roman Empire. And he takes the tradition of the Old Testament and he radicalizes it. You know, the Old Testament wisdom was an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, you know, retribution, but Jesus says no, it's not going to be that way anymore. We're not going to, you know, give violence for violence. We're going to do something better, something different, something that's going to change the cycle and make it do something different. I think it's really easy for a lot of us to say that we are pro-war when we've never really experienced war. So many of us have never served in the military overseas. Most of us have never experienced the travesty of our hometown being devastated by bombs or, overrun with tanks and armies from other countries. So I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind when we're dialoguing about these issues, is that we haven't experienced war, and it's really easy to say we're for war when we've never, lived in the midst of it. I know that my perspective of war and peace changed dramatically when I went to Colombia with CPT, and I met people who were forced off their land and who had violent raids happen to them on a regular basis. I was a committed pacifist at that point, but even more so after meeting those people and getting to know them and speak with them and understand the grave realities of what violence on such a massive scale does to people and does to communities. I want to encourage you to keep challenging one another and searching, no matter what side of the fence you fall on. What we need most in some of these debates is open dialogue and loving dialogue with one another. We need to be talking about them, not just assuming that people think one thing or the other, keeping things to ourselves, but to talk with one another and, get out what's on our hearts. And, the Bible's changed my heart, and I'm sure it's changed many of yours.